Hello everyone, I would like to welcome you all to our grant writing workshop for our 2021 Clinical Innovation Round. I'm Laura Pareezer, I'm the Head of Research Operations for Wesley Medical Research. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm just going to give you an overview of the grant round and the application, what's involved in the application. And Rob in Ware, in his presentation, will take you through the finer details of submitting an application. So in 2019, Wesley Medical Research established a research and grants framework. This provides the platform to ensure that there are some clear principles governing the manner in which WMR awards funding. So there are three guiding principles. The first is that researchers must apply for funding through an open and competitive grant round so that it's equitable, that grant applications are assessed in accordance with defined criteria by a board-appointed research committee, and that research committee is comprised of independent experts to ensure that the funding decisions are free from bias and prejudice. So moving to the key eligibility criteria, the most important eligibility criteria is that the primary applicant must be a healthcare professional, for example, a doctor, nurse, pharmacist who works at one of or more of our UnitingCare hospitals in Queensland, that the research team must be able to demonstrate a strong and genuine partnership between the primary applicant, who is that healthcare professional, and an experienced researcher. So that's to provide the academic rigour to the research proposal. And that the proposed research must be clinical by that, so that includes health services research. Basic or preclinical or scientific research is unlikely to be funded. The research must also align with the missions and aims of Wesley Medical Research and focus on the improvement of healthcare delivery, health outcomes, and or quality of life for patients at our UnitingCare hospitals. So in terms of the key assessment criteria, it's important that you first start with a research question or a problem that you're trying to solve. Then in your proposal, you must show that your proposal has well-defined achievable goals, objectives, milestones, and deliverables. You need to also show that the objectives of your research are well supported by some evidence base. So that can be preliminary data, some clinical case studies, or evidence from literature, such as 5 key papers. You need to also show that your strategy, methodology, and analysis defined in the proposal are well-reasoned and that you are able to accomplish the specific aims of the project. And Rob will spend quite some time stepping you through this. You also need to show that the applicant, which is the research team, has the experience, expertise, and the ability to implement that proposed research as demonstrated by your track record. We do ask you for specifics in your track record in your application. And sometimes you may feel like your track record isn't good enough. Please don't worry about that. It's just important to show what you've got as your record as it stands right now. You also need to show that the budget for your research proposal is sufficient to deliver on that research question and represents value for money. So just some general do's and don'ts. I would suggest that you use lay terms wherever possible. You need to remember that the assessment panel are experts in their fields, but won't necessarily be across the intricacies of your fields. Limit technical jargon. It really improves readability. If you resist using jargon, only abbreviate or use acronyms if this will help the assessor understand your work. It is important to try and be excited in your narrative that you submit. So it just makes for a more engaging read. Be clear in your overview about how the research team will contribute to achieving your research objectives. And you must be specific about how the experienced researcher will provide guidance to the primary applicant, who's that healthcare professional. Make sure your milestones are realistic, and we do request that your milestones are no more than 6 months apart. And also consider the risks associated with your project and the strategies to manage these risks. So one example I've listed here is around recruitment. So if you've got a limited patient population for your research proposal, just consider what pitfalls you might come across as you're trying to recruit and how you can address these. Can you extend who's helping you recruit, or can you include a different site? Those sort of strategies. And in terms of WMR support, as well as just general assistance with your application, any questions you might have, we can offer up to 2 hours of study design, methodology support and statistics support per primary applicant from an expert researcher. And there is some direct research support that you can build into your budget. This includes the initial ethics application for preparation and submission to UnitingCare Health Human Research Ethics Committee and some statistical support. We can also offer some help with your good clinical practice training. We do require that all applicants have a current good clinical practice certificate. We can recommend some training providers, and if there's enough interest, I can link you up to one of our preferred training providers who can offer online training and also some additional support with that training. For ethics application assistance, if you want to do that on your own, I would suggest that you contact Shannon Lytris from UnitingCare Health Human Research Ethics Committee before you start, and I've included the URL to contact her there. So this year, for the Clinical Innovation Grant Round, we've got $1.02 million available. That includes, we've got some tied funding in neurology, neurosurgery and cardiovascular. And in terms of the general research funding pot across all UnitingCare hospitals, the total funding available is $585,000. So you can submit a seeding grant of up to $35,000 or a project grant of up to $100,000. Some key dates for this year's grant round. The round opened on the 2nd of August and closes on the 5th of October. Research Committee will assess your applications by the 8th of November, and we are going to interview with shortlisted applicants. It'll just be a 5-minute short interview, and we'll provide more details closer to the time. It just gives us an opportunity to just tease out a little bit more around your application at that interview. Then the Strategy and Development Committee, who's a subcommittee of our Wesley Medical Research Board, will have final approvals by the 15th of December 2021, with applicants notified of the outcomes on the 10th of January 2022. For further information, please visit Wesley Medical Research's website. All the information around the grant round is on our landing page, or please contact my colleague Emma Brake, who will assist you in any way she can at research@wesleyresearch.org.au. And that's it all from me. Thank you and good luck with your applications.
Hi everybody, thanks for joining this session today. My name is Robert Ware. I'm a Professor of Statistics and Epidemiology in the Menzies Health Institute, Queensland at Griffith University, and I work with the researchers at the Wesley Medical Institute to sort of enhance the quality of their grant applications. And I guess as part of that role, I'm going to give a little session today just about the methodological aspects that people should think about, or that it's helpful to think about when you're writing your grant applications. And so I've got a few PowerPoint slides, probably will take 15 to 20 minutes to run through them all. So I'm going to share my screen. And so here we are, 2021, the Clinical Research Grant Round. I'm going to talk about study design. As I said, my name is Rob Ware, and there's my email address down the bottom of the screen. Happy to take, emails at any time. sorry. So in this session, we're going to cover the important aspects to think about when you're writing your grant proposal. So in particular, I'm going to concentrate on the methodological aspects of your application. I won't be talking too technically. If you do want to talk technically, then please email me, always happy to talk technical. But today, this little session is really about thinking about what are the things that really need to go into a grant application and how can we structure that application so that all the things, all the individual components fit together nicely. When you're writing a grant, the formats for basically clinical research studies are reasonably standard. And so just I've reviewed quite a lot of grants in the last decade or so. And I guess the grants that are probably reviewed the most favourably have this basic structure. So the first 10% is really an executive summary. This is where, when reviewers have many grants to read, they'll look at the first page. And if you're a reviewer, it's really helpful if you can look at the first page and you can see straight away why the project is important, what the aims and hypotheses of the project are. So normally I'd say that would be about 10% of the total length of the grant. Then there's the background. So the background, of course, is where you need to convince the reviewer this is a really important project. This is the literature as it exists. This is what I'm going to add to the literature. And if you've done any pilot work, then that's where you'll try and tie in your pilot work towards the end of the background. The main bit of the grant is the research plan. This is about half the length of the grant typically. And it's bolded on the screen because that's what I'm going to talk about now. And so you need to think about the methods for the grant, and in particular, I'm going to talk about sample size and statistical analysis plans because I know that those are sort of things that people have a lot of issues with, and so I'm probably just going to spend a bit of time on them today. Then at the end of the grant, you want to tell the reviewer what changes are going to come, to patients, to their carers, to the population, to the health system as a result of your grant if you get the money and you run your study successfully. This is really your sort of who cares moment. You're giving a reason. You're showing the readers why your work is so important and how significant it is and how things are going to be changed because your grant has been funded and run successfully. Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to run through those sections one by one. So I guess in the summary section, this is your executive summary. It's just the chance to show the reviewers that you're considering a really important problem. Perhaps it costs the healthcare system a lot of money. Perhaps it's very burdensome for the patients and their families. It's really about just showing this is a really important thing to consider. And then you want to say what your study aims are. So you need to say, the aim of my study is to blah, 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 blah. And then you can talk about your hypotheses as well. Of course, your aims and your hypotheses have to align. And when you're setting out your aim, make sure that it's specific enough to be measurable. Okay. So at the end of the grant, you've got the money, you've run your study, someone is going to look back and say, was that money well spent? And they're going to look at your aims. And so if you've got measurable aims, then it will be easy for you to show, this is what the aim was, and this is what I did, so I achieved my aim. So it's all about, making things measurable. So the research plan, this is sort of about 50% of the grant. And, the the research plan generally follows a standard order. You talk about the participants, you talk about the interventions, you talk about the outcomes, you run through the quality criteria, and then you talk about your statistical analysis plan. So this is, when you write an academic paper, it sort of follows the recipe, and it's the same thing when you're writing a grant. Really helpful place to start is by looking at the website of the Equator Network, and so you can see the URL down the bottom there. You've probably heard of checklists for all the different studies. So the most famous is probably the Consort guidelines for randomized trials. There's another couple of examples there, STROBE for observational studies and STARD for diagnostic studies. And so these checklists, I find them really helpful because they have a whole list of items that should be covered when you're reporting these type of studies. So when you're designing studies, then of course the checklists are really helpful then as well. So almost the first thing I would do is I would go to the Equator Network website and I'd download the checklists that applied to your study design. And so I can, when I'm writing my research plan, I can make sure I've got all the items covered. The first of the major items is when you want to talk about your participants. So, of course, you're thinking about this in terms of how is a reviewer going to think when they read my grant. So what the reviewer wants to know is where are you going to get your patients from? Who are your participants? Who are your participants going to be? So in terms of perhaps age range, gender age, disease status. What are my inclusion and exclusion criteria? And so it's important to show that whatever sample size you end up coming up with at the end of the research plan, that it's feasible for you to recruit that many participants as part of your study. Okay, if you've got a very rare disease that you want to study, there's no point saying that you're going to study 1,000 participants because in your review will know that that's not possible. If you've got a very intensive intervention, then you can't say you're going to study thousands of participants because it will be obvious to the reviewer that it won't be feasible to follow up that many participants for the study budget that's being offered and the study time that's being offered. So it's just about showing the reviewer that you know what you're doing and saying something that's believable and feasible. In the research plan, the next thing you'll talk about is usually the intervention. And so I'm using the word intervention because I'm thinking of a clinician coming in and doing something. It won't necessarily be an intervention. It could be so I guess I'm using education in the broad sense in terms of it could be an education program. It's really what you are doing in your research proposal. So I'd say the key things are to describe the intervention clearly. And so, often I find that because people are so engaged and so focused on their work, sometimes you can read these very technical descriptions, but remember that there's a very good chance that a non-expert will be the person who's reviewing your application. So you need to use language that a non-clinician can understand. So, in the example I've given is a statistician. So someone like me who reviews grants. See, although I know a lot about statistics, I don't know very much about a lot of areas of healthcare. So I think if you're writing it for me, then you're going to need to write it simply enough that I can understand what you're actually trying to do. And when you're designing your intervention, then bear in mind that you're going to be rated on the methodological quality of your proposal. And so when talk about methodological quality, what I'm really talking about is bias. So reviewers will want to know that you've done your best to reduce as many sources of bias as possible. So for example, have you got a placebo? If you haven't got a placebo, that might necessarily be important, as long as the assessor who's assessing your outcome is masked to study treatment. So, or perhaps the clinician, the treating clinician, is masked. It's about thinking about the process of your study and thinking at each stage in a participant's journey through the study, is there anything I can do to reduce the bias, either from the patient, from the patient's family, from the treating clinician, from the person who's assessing the outcome. These are all the people or actors in your study who can introduce different sorts of bias. So when you're designing an intervention, it's just thinking carefully about how can I make this intervention as high a quality as possible. Your outcomes. So obviously, very important area. And I guess you want to specify one primary outcome in your study. And of course, the outcome you specify needs to be linked to the aim of your study that you talked about right at the start of your proposal, and to your study hypotheses. For the primary outcome, you need to specify how it's measured and when it's measured. And so, only choose one outcome. Often, sometimes people will list 10 different primary outcomes. So as a reviewer, that's not that helpful. When you're a reviewer, you just want to focus on one primary outcome. So tell me what that primary outcome is, and tell me when you're going to measure it. Are you going to measure it 3 days after treatment initiation, 1 week, 6 months? What's the optimal time for this intervention to be measured? When you're thinking about a primary outcome, make sure it's one that's sensitive enough to measure change. So, how will you know if your intervention has actually worked? How will you know if it's made an improvement? You need to choose an outcome that will be able to capture any improvement that you expect to see. And of course, when we think about whether an intervention's worked, we mean that in terms of, can the outcome measure clinically important change, and can it measure statistically significant change? So both are important. And then I guess the last point is one that I talked about. Just remember to make sure that the primary outcome is linked back to the primary aim and hypotheses. So you want there to be a flow all through your proposal. You start off by the aim, and you've got an aim for the study, and then everything you write through your research plan has to lead the reviewer on a journey to show them that that with the data that you're proposing to collect in the participant population that you're proposing to enrol, you will be able to answer the primary aim of your study. So it's all about making sure that things are consistent throughout your research plan. So as an example of primary outcomes, like, you want something to be specific, you want it to be measurable. So you wouldn't say something like the primary outcome is growth restriction. You wouldn't even say something like the primary outcome is being small for gestational age. What you would say is something like the primary outcome is the binary variable small for gestational age, and that's defined using the 10th percentile cutoff for gestational age, conditional on sex, according to CDC norms. Okay, so with that last outcome on the slide, you're being quite clear about what you're measuring, and you're being clear about how you're going to measure it, and then any reviewer will be able to see that, and they'll immediately know exactly what you're going to do, and they would immediately know that they could reproduce that themselves with any sort of particular data set that you have. When we're thinking about outcomes, just think, are you measuring things on scales? So, for example, are you measuring quality of life? If you are measuring a scale, then try and find a scale that already exists, and that scale is valid, and that scale is reproducible. In other words, please don't try and measure quality of life by making up your own questionnaire. You know, there are questionnaires and scales and tools available for many outcomes in health research. So, you know, please try and use them. The things that are reviewable we want to know is, if you're using a scale, is it valid? So in other words, does it measure what you actually say it's measuring? And is it reproducible? So in other words, if two different people ran the tool, would they get the same result? And so, you know, any decent tool that you identify in the literature, the validity and the reproducibility of that tool will have been published. So you can just, you know, get a couple of key statistics from about the validity and the reproducibility, and include those in your research plan to show that actually this tool, it does do what you say that it does, and other people have used it, and it's valid and it's reliable. Now, I guess we're getting on to the perhaps interesting if you're me, or scary if you're lots of other people, part of the research plan. I guess that's where you're thinking about the sample size calculations. And I'd say this is worth spending a little bit of time on, because you can almost guarantee that this will be checked by reviewers. And so when you're writing your sample size calculation, what you want to do is give sufficient detail that your calculation can be reproduced, and you want to use standard calculations. So, you know, I would, and you know, for most study designs, there are standard calculations, and there's calculators that can be accessed through the web, and they're reasonably easy to use. And so for most study designs, look, you should be able to use a standard calculation. Again, make sure that your calculation relates back to your primary outcome, which of course relates back to your study aim. And then I guess that will relate forward to the analysis plan. So again, it's about keeping the same story, you know, through your proposal. Look, there are lots of programs on the internet that you can access to do these calculations. But if you're worried about what you're doing, then I guess ask a statistician. I guess, as I said at the start, I'm happy to take questions, or I guess if you have a colleague, or you know, basically somebody who sort of knows what they're doing, then it's always good to check. Look, for most standard designs, there are calculators on the web. As your study design gets more complicated, then of course also your sample size calculation gets more complicated as well. And so, you know, the more complicated it gets, the more guesses are involved. So I'd say that the key thing in your sample size calculation is really to show the reviewer that you recognise that there are particular quirks to your design, and that you're going to take them into account when you do your sample size calculation and when you do your statistical analysis. So the example I've got on the slide is for cluster randomised trials. And so if you've got a cluster randomised trial, then you need to take into account the non-independence within clusters. And we do that by calculating something called a design effect. And we do that by specifying the intercluster correlation, the ICC, and the median cluster size. So of course those the actual values for the ICC and the median cluster size are often really difficult to find. So sometimes you just have to have a guess. But even if you include words like, we have inflated our sample size by 10% to account for the clustering, within groups, talking back to whatever the groups in your research plan are. So even if you include a sentence like that, then you're showing the reviewer that actually you do understand some of the quirks about your study design, and you are adjusting your design to take those quirks into account. Even if you're including a lot of guesses in sample size calculations always include guesses. If they didn't include guesses, we'd already know the answer, and if you already knew the answer, you wouldn't have to do the research. So, by definition, there's guesswork involved. I always think it's better to have a guess than to say things like, in a previous study, they recruited 150 participants and they got P equals 0.04, so we're going to get 150 as well. That doesn't really make any sense. Please don't say something like, we haven't got any data to base our assumptions on, so we haven't done a sample size calculation. It's always better to have a guess. Even if you have no faith in your guess, it's still better than saying, I didn't do it. I guess the third point is something you typically see. It's like, our unit sees 50 patients a year, and our study's going to go for 4 years, so we're going to recruit 200 participants. It's, in terms of your primary aim, it's not really that helpful. For some primary aims, 200 is a lot, and for some primary aims, 200 is not very many. So it's not about how many participants you can potentially recruit. It's about how does the number of participants relate back to the primary aim of your study. And the statistical analysis section, in your research plan, will be reasonably brief, but this is the typical, even if you just had 4 sentences, then the 4 sentences would cover the summary statistics, primary outcome, secondary outcome, and then any sensitivity analysis. So the first sentence might be something like, summarise continuous data using mean, standard deviation, categorical data using frequency and percentage. Something like that would be fairly typical. Then your primary outcome, the text would be, for the primary outcome of blah, 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 we will test this using and then give the, specifically say the type of test you're going to do. Is it going to be a student's t-test? Is it going to be linear regression? So be specific about the type of test you're going to use. Then you talk about your secondary outcomes, because often there are lots of secondary outcomes and you don't have much space. You can be a bit more general. So, and I guess I think I've got some general terms on the next slide. And then the last point is about, are you going to do any stratified analyses? Are you going to do any sensitivity analysis? So stratified analysis might be, first you analyse everyone all together, and then you'll analyse males separately and females separately. A sensitivity analysis might be, we analysed, we did an intention to treat analysis because we did a randomised trial analysing people according to the groups that they were randomly allocated to. But then to test the sensitivity of that, we did what we call an as-treated analysis, which is where people got analysed according to what treatment they actually got, because, and you do that if there was non-compliance in your randomised control trial. So in other words, people got assigned to a particular treatment and then didn't actually end up getting that treatment. Yeah. And so I guess this slide is sort of emphasising what I was talking about. Just make sure your analysis plan is unambiguous. like with the sample size, it's just about showing the reviewer that you've actually thought about how your data will be analysed. And in the example, again, it's not a comment like we will conduct multivariate regression analyses. It will be, you know, we will conduct multivariable linear regression or multivariable logistic regression. So it's just, there doesn't need to be a lot of detail, but just enough detail to know, to let the reviewer know that you've actually thought a little bit carefully about what you're doing. And I guess when I was thinking about the secondary outcomes, I was thinking about this slide here. So, you know, even if you just say for our secondary outcomes measured using interval data, we will analyse using linear regression. For secondary outcomes that are measured with binary data, we can use logistic regression, count data, Poisson, survival data, a Cox proportional hazards model, something like that. It doesn't have to be a lot of detail, but just show that you know that data measured in different formats needs to be analysed using different methods. And then just the final comments, I guess, you know, this is about being specific in your research plan. You know, don't use generic terms like outcome. You know, be specific about your particular outcome. For my primary outcome of blah, 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 then, you know, then the reviewer knows that you've thought about your analysis. You haven't just copy and pasted some generic text from somewhere else. Okay, and of course, as part of the grant scheme, you can include a budget for statistical support in your application. I just copied and pasted this little section of text straight off the grants document. And yes, so of course I'm going to be happy if people include a budget for statistical support. Okay, so hopefully those that made a little bit of sense. Of course, happy to answer any questions at any time. Please just send me an email. Happy to meet, you know, over Teams or Zoom to talk about, to talk through any specific questions about the research plan. Yeah, just let me know and we can organise a time.